July 15th, 1015. The suburban princely residence of Berestovo, near Kyiv, the dead of night. Listen closely. In the princely tower, axes are rhythmically striking wood. But this isn't an assault. There are no enemies outside the walls. These are loyal men, the inner circle, who right at this very moment are breaking down the wooden wall of their own residence. They are rushing, tearing off the planks to widen the passage. Through the breach in the wall, secretly, like thieves, they carry out a heavy carpet. Wrapped inside this carpet is a dead body. In the shadows of the courtyard, Anastas the Korsunian silently watches. The cunning Greek treasurer, who is already feverishly calculating in his mind how to most safely smuggle his gold out of the city. The body is loaded onto a sled in the middle of summer. Through the mud and grass, the sled is dragged toward Kyiv to hide the corpse in the Church of the Tithes. The man lying in this sled had, during his lifetime, united millions of square kilometers. He wiped ancient cities off the face of the earth and built new ones. He changed the religion of an entire part of the world. But right now, he is being buried, in secret, in the dark, because his entourage is paralyzed by primal terror. They know, as soon as the country wakes up and learns of the ruler's death, his own sons will start slaughtering each other for the throne. The paradox of this scene is utterly deafening. The greatest monarch of Eastern Europe, the baptizer and saint, dies enveloped in paralyzing fear of his own flesh and blood. In previous episodes of our series, this man constantly appeared somewhere on the periphery. We saw him through the eyes of others, through the eyes of the violated Ronyeda, through the eyes of his obedient uncle Dobrynya, through the eyes of the calculating Anastas. He appeared sometimes as a monster, sometimes as a puppet, sometimes as a religious fanatic. Now, the time has come to put this puzzle together. Today, we will strip away the judgments of others and climb straight into the mind of the architect himself. We will look at the birth of the empire through his eyes. This will not be a story about sudden divine revelation or the miraculous transformation of a sinner into a saint. We are going to dissect the harsh, pragmatic, and at times terrifying technology of how a state is constructed out of a fragmented tribal cartel. How did it happen that a fratricide, a rapist, and the leader of a bloody pagan cult went down in history as the Red Sun? And why does his true historical triumph have absolutely nothing to do with piety? The story of any dictator begins with vulnerability. Imagine the princely court in Kyiv in the 1960s. Grand Prince Sviatoslav, that relentless conqueror who lives in the saddle and sleeps with a saddle under his head, is almost never home. He is waging wars in the Balkans and the Caucasus. In Kyiv, his sons are growing up. The eldest, Yarapok, is the legitimate heir. The middle son, Oleg, is also born to a noble wife. And then there is the third, the youngest, Vladimir, the son of the housekeeper Malusha, a slave who managed the household of Princess Olga. Behind this boy's back, people constantly whisper a single word: Robotchich, son of a slave. In the world of the 10th century, where status dictates absolutely everything, Vladimir understands from early childhood his brothers have a right by birth and he does not. While Yarapok and Oleg will inherit power simply by the right of their blood, he will have to tear out his right to exist with his bare teeth. An inferiority complex is a terrifying fuel. It is precisely this complex that will transform into that very thirst for absolute, undisputed power that will drive Vladimir for his entire life. Before another military campaign, Sviatoslav divides his lands. He leaves Yaropolk in Kyiv. He places Oleg with the Drevlians. And then ambassadors arrive for Vladimir from the distant, freezing, and eternally rebellious Novgorod. They ask for a prince of their own. Sviatoslav waves them off. Take the youngest. For a 10-year-old boy, this trip north with his uncle Dobrynya is not a promotion. It is an exile to a dangerous frontier, as far away from the capital as possible. And then Sviatoslav is killed by the Pechenegs at the Dnieper Rapids. Suddenly, a massive territory, held together solely by the fear of one man, begins to burst at the seams. In Kyiv, Yaropolk sits on the throne, but you and I know who was actually running the capital in those days. Standing behind the young prince is the gray-haired warlord Sveneld, that same old schemer from our first episode, who whispers words into Yaropolk's ear, stoking the flames of hatred. Sveneld is taking revenge on the middle brother, Oleg, for the death of his own son. And Yaropolk listens. Thus begins the first civil war in the history of Rus. The year is 977. Ovrich, the middle brother, Oleg, dies in a crush on a bridge while trying to escape from the Kievan army. The news of this death reaches the snow-covered Novgorod. Vladimir sits in his tower and puts two and two together. Brother has killed brother. Sveneld is purging Yaropolk's competitors, and he is the last one left. Vladimir understands with crystal clarity. They will not even attempt to negotiate with him. He possesses no legitimacy for the old aristocracy to stand up and defend him. They will simply come to slit his throat. And so, Vladimir makes the first adult decision of his life. He abandons Novgorod. He abandons the principality, and together with his uncle Dobrynya, he boards the longships, sailing away across the icy waves of the Baltic, overseas, to Scandinavia. He runs, but not to hide. He who lacks the right of blood knows the only right respected in this world is the right of steel. The story of any dictator begins with vulnerability. The Baltic Sea at the end of the 10th century is not just cold water. It is the primary economic artery of Northern Europe, around which colossal amounts of money and professional private armies revolve. It is precisely here, fleeing from Kievan assassins, that the ships of the fugitive Novgorod prince arrive in the winter of 977. Vladimir is about 17 years old. He has no treasury, no warband, and no lands. He has only his grim uncle Dobrynya standing behind his shoulder and a resonant name. To the arrogant elites of Kyiv, he is a bastard and the son of a slave. But to Scandinavia, he is a descendant of Rurik, the legitimate representative of the dynasty that controls the most profitable trade transit corridor on the continent. Chronicles usually describe this period with one standard throwaway phrase: he fled across the sea and gathered the Varangians. But let's strip away this fairy tale simplicity and look at the situation through the eyes of a pragmatist. You cannot simply land on the Norwegian shore and politely ask for an army of thousands to solve your family problems. A fleet and professional mercenaries cost mountains of silver, which the fugitive simply did not have. Vladimir goes to the one man capable of providing such a resource, to the powerful ruler Håkon Jarl. That very Håkon Jarl, ruthless politician and staunch pagan, who fiercely defended the old gods against the advancing tide of Christianity. He controlled the best ports and military personnel in the region. It was with him that the young Vladimir had to strike the deal of his life. How do you buy a fleet when your chests are empty? You have to sell the future. Vladimir offers the Scandinavians a share in the most ambitious geopolitical startup of the era. He promises them control over the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks and the right to unhindered plunder upon victory. And right here lies the most crucial psychological shift in our hero. Vladimir does not return to Rus as a noble monarch coming to reclaim his father's throne. He returns as the CEO of a massive foreign military corporation, and the Scandinavian army of that era is not made up of submissive conscripts. It is a heavily armed assembly of shareholders. Every Varangian invested his life, his sword, and his chainmail into this campaign, calculating on very specific dividends. Vladimir perfectly understood his position. As long as he promises gold and leads them to plunder, they call him their chieftain. But the moment he shows weakness or says there is no money, these very same loyal warriors will slit his throat in his sleep without a second's hesitation. 3 years later, in the spring of 980, the horizon over the Volkhov River darkens with striped sails. Heavy longships enter the river. Vladimir returns to Novgorod with a terrifying force behind him. His older brother Yaropolk's governors flee without a fight, managing only to hear a cold ultimatum: "Go to my brother and tell him, Vladimir is marching against you. Prepare for battle." It seems the path to the capital is wide open. The flywheel of revenge has been set in motion, but the massive foreign army suddenly hits the brakes. The Varangian shareholders refuse to march on the heavily fortified Kyiv and risk their heads clashing with Yaropolk's regular troops just for the promise of future rewards. They demand an advance payment. The mercenaries need a massive score right now to be convinced of their employer's solvency. Vladimir urgently needs to find silver and blood. Otherwise, his campaign will end in a mutiny of disgruntled creditors before it even truly begins. And he finds a target. Lying directly on the path to Kyiv is a wealthy, independent, and proud city, capable of more than covering all his military expenses. The city of Polotsk. In one of our previous episodes, we covered the fall of Polotsk through the eyes of Princess Rugnida. Back then, it looked like a story of blinding, savage cruelty. But if we remove the emotions and look at those exact same events from Vladimir's captain's bridge, the picture shifts completely. The rape of Rugnida and the murder of her father Radvilad is not an outburst of barbarian wrath over a rejected marriage proposal. For Vladimir, it is a cold mathematical calculation. He needed to deliver the promised loot to his Scandinavian army of thousands so they would continue the march. Polotsk became this bloody bonus payout, and the brutal massacre of the ruling family served as a clear, undeniable signal to Kiev. If you do not surrender yourselves, the exact same thing will happen to you. A few months later, the march south is complete. The older brother, Yaropolk, betrayed by his own inner circle, dies in the doorway of the Kievan tower by the swords of mercenaries. Vladimir enters the capital and ascends his father's throne, but the triumph is short-lived. The Varangian commanders walk into the princely chambers. They do not look at Vladimir as their sovereign, but rather as the manager who hired them, and they state their terms. In the chronicles, their demand is recorded briefly. "This city is ours. We took it. We want a ransom 2 grivnas for every person, 2 silver grivnas for every resident, an astronomical, impossible sum for a treasury ravaged by civil war." In this moment, Vladimir realizes his most glaring vulnerability. He is not the master of Rus. He is a hostage of an armed syndicate. If he answers with a refusal, these men, who just seated him on the throne, will throw his body into the Dnieper without hesitation and find themselves a new paymaster. How does a politician survive when his capital is held hostage by his own army? Vladimir applies a method that will become the cornerstone of his diplomacy in the future. He agrees, buys time, and then stabs them in the back. He asks the mercenaries to wait 1 month, allegedly to collect the silver. The Varangians relax, set up camps around the city, and wait. Meanwhile, Vladimir carefully selects a small group from among their ranks, the most loyal, experienced, and compliant fighters. To them, he gives the remnants of his treasury, transforming them into his personal, elite guard. To the rest of the mercenary mass, he announces there will be no money. Realizing they have been deceived, the furious army demands safe passage further south to Byzantium, where the emperor always paid in gold. Vladimir willingly gives them ships, but as soon as their sails disappear over the horizon, he dispatches his own fast messenger to Constantinople. The messenger carries a letter to the emperor from the new ruler of Kyiv. The Varangians are coming to you. Do not keep them together in the capital, or they will raise a rebellion. Scatter them across different garrisons and detain their leaders. Thus, Vladimir eliminates the very threat he brought to Rus, using the hands of others. He solves the tactical problem brilliantly, but when the dust settles, the prince is left one-on-one with a colossal, fragmented territory. The tribes of the Krivichians, Radomichians, and Vyaticians look at Kyiv with deep suspicion. Keeping them all in line using only the sheer force of a small detachment is impossible. Fear only works as long as you are standing right there with a raised sword. He needed a tool that would force people to obey from a distance, a tool that penetrates the mind of every farmer and warrior. And so, Vladimir decides to create new gods for the country. The year is 980. Kyiv, a hill right behind the princely tower. Hundreds of men, boots digging deep into the mud, pull heavy oak trunks on thick ropes. Axes echo. 6 massive, freshly carved idols are dug into the earth. Right in the center towers Perun, with a silver head and a golden mustache, staring arrogantly over the waters of the Dnieper. Historians usually call this the first religious reform in Rus. But let's throw away the textbooks and look at this scene through the eyes of a pragmatic politician. Vladimir sits in captured Kyiv and assesses his assets. He has a loyal guard and control over the river transit. But stretching between the trade hubs are thousands of kilometers of dense, impenetrable forests inhabited by the Drevlians, Vyaticians, Krivichians, Radomichians. Every tribe believes in its own forest spirits. Every tribe lives by its own closed laws. To them, the prince in Kyiv is just a racketeer with a strong army. You pay him tribute and go on with your life. No connection, no unity. Holding this boiling cauldron together with swords alone is impossible. There isn't enough steel. Fear has its limits. Vladimir needed glue, an ideology that would force the inhabitant of the northern swamps to consider himself part of the same mechanism as the southern steppe dweller. And so, the prince engineers new gods. Look at the composition of this Kievan pantheon. Perun, the god of thunder, the patron of the Scandinavian and Slavic military elite. Dazbog and Stribog, ancient spirits of the sun and wind for the peasants. Mokosh, the patroness of women and weaving. And right beside them, suddenly, Kors and Samargal appear, deities with clear Eastern Iranian roots, easily understood by the mercenaries and merchants from the steppe. This is not an ancient, organically grown religion. This is a political Frankenstein. Coldly and calculatingly, Vladimir gathers the idols of all the main demographic groups of his transit empire onto one hill. He is literally telling them, look, your gods now live in my capital. They stand under the hand of my Perun. We are one system. To cement the effect, he sends his uncle Dobrynya to the far north, and there, in rebellious Novgorod, Dobrynya erects the exact same Perun over the Volkhov River. The network is deployed. The state receives a unified ideological interface. It seems like a stroke of managerial genius, but this artificial construct harbored a hidden, fatal flaw. Paganism is an extremely utilitarian system. It has no complex theology or concept of forgiveness. It is a contract. You give the god a sacrifice, the god gives you military luck. And to prove to the people that this new synthetic pantheon actually works, Vladimir needed to constantly feed it with victories. He needed a massive, highly profitable war. Without it, the new gods would quickly turn into useless pieces of wood. Vladimir gathers his war band and casts his gaze eastward. There, beyond the Volga, the wealthy state of the Volga Bulgars flourishes. The prince sets out on a campaign, planning to bring mountains of silver back to Kyiv for his mercenaries and priests. He doesn't yet know that instead of silver, he will bring back an idea that will force him to question absolutely everything he has built. The year 985, the great Volga River. Vladimir marches east for silver. The Scandinavian mercenaries are thirsty for loot. The Kievan priests demand new sacrifices, and the treasury needs replenishing. The target of the campaign is Volga, Bulgaria, a spectacularly wealthy state that controls the trade arteries between Asia and northern Europe. The Kievan army descends on longships, while their nomadic Tork cavalry allies ride along the riverbank. The battle is brief and brutal. The Bulgars are crushed. Thousands of bound prisoners sit on the scorched battlefield. And here, a scene takes place that will permanently alter the young prince's optics. Vladimir and his uncle Dobrynya walk slowly along the rows of captured enemies. In a previous episode, we already recalled this moment, but now look at it through the eyes of a man building a state. Dobrynya is not looking at the faces of the prisoners. He is looking at their feet. Every single Bulgar is wearing sturdy, well-crafted leather boots. For the 10th century, boots are not just an article of clothing. They are a marker, a sign of advanced craftsmanship, a complex economy, and high self-respect. Dobrynya turns to his nephew and utters a phrase that the chronicler will preserve verbatim. They wear boots. These men won't pay us tribute. Let's go look for those who wear bast shoes. If you think about it, it is precisely in this minute, on the banks of the Volga, that a Viking dies and a politician is born. If Vladimir's father, the furious Sviatoslav, had been in his place, he would have simply slaughtered the prisoners, taken the silver, and burned the cities to the ground. That is how the old logic of the raid functioned. But Vladimir does something that neither his war band nor the defeated expect. He orders the prisoners to be untied, and he concludes an equal, mutually beneficial trade peace with the Bulgars. They seal it with an oath that sounds like a spell. Only when stones begin to float and hops sink in water, only then will we break this treaty. Why did he do this? For the first time in his life, Vladimir encountered a state that fundamentally differed from his own forest empire, which was held together only by blood. The Bulgars practiced Islam. Their society was united not by the fear of mercenaries and not by blind chance. They were united by a single god, a clear law, and a strict order. The prince saw a system where religion functions as an economic and legal foundation. The men in boots proved to be far more profitable as living partners than as dead enemies. Returning to Kiev, Vladimir looks at his creation, the sanctuary, with its 6 wooden idols, with completely different eyes. This system is primitive. It requires constant war and human meat, but offers nothing in return. It is obsolete. But the prince doesn't yet know just how dangerous this old system has become. The very moment he triumphantly rides into the capital, his artificial gods slip out of his control, and the Kievan mob demands blood that Vladimir never planned to give them. Kyiv, a heavy, oppressive evening. Vladimir sits in his princely tower and listens. From Podil, the lower part of the city, the growing roar of a mob drifts upward, then the sound of axes striking oak logs, and screams. Down there, at this exact moment, the people of Kyiv are murdering two men, an old Varangian veteran and his young son. We know these people from church texts as the first Russian martyrs, Theodore and John. But let's drop the hagiographic tone and look at what is happening from the window of the princely tower. Why is a ruler, whose army has just forced its neighbors into submission, sitting in his chambers and allowing a mob to slaughter his own elite mercenaries? Because he cannot stop them. The pagan machine, which Vladimir himself had engineered on the Kievan hill, demanded its toll. The warband returned with a victory. According to ancient logic, the gods needed to be thanked with blood. The priests cast lots, and the lot fell on the courtyard of that very Varangian who happened to practice Christianity. When they came to the veteran to take his son to the altar, he stood in the doorway with a weapon in hand, and he threw words at the mob that shattered their established order. He said their wooden idols were just log shear today and rotting tomorrow. To the fanatic crowd, this was not just an insult. It was a glitch in the matrix. The people went berserk. They didn't even engage the Varangian in a proper fight. They simply chopped down the support pillars of the gallery where he stood with his son, collapsing the entire house on top of them. Now, let's return to Vladimir. He listens to the crackling of breaking timber and draws a conclusion terrifying for any monarch. He no longer controls the violence in his own capital. In the 10th century, power is the monopoly on death. Only the prince decides who lives and who dies. But right now, Vladimir sees that a blind wooden lot and a handful of priests hold more power over the Kievans than his own armed guard. If he sends his elite troops right now to save the Varangians, the mob will decide that the prince has gone against the gods, and the very same axes currently chopping down a house in Podil will start chopping down the doors of his residence tomorrow. On this night, Vladimir finally realizes his ideological project of 980 has completely failed. The synthetic pantheon turned out to be not a tool of governance, but a ticking time bomb. Paganism is too chaotic. It hands power to the mob and the priests, it demands human meat, but it guarantees the monarch absolutely no protection. The prince needed a fundamentally different operating system, a single god who would sanctify the ruler's power rather than dictate terms to him through a random drawing of lots. A religion where the law is written in ink, not in blood on an altar. He decides to cancel the old gods, but to do this, he needed to find new ones. And Vladimir begins the most cynical casting call in the history of Eastern Europe. In history textbooks, this event is traditionally called the choice of faith. The chronicles paint a beautiful picture. A wise prince sits in his chambers while preachers of various religions take turns presenting their cases, offering the salvation of his soul. But we agreed to look at things through the eyes of a pragmatist. Vladimir's soul was the absolute least of his concerns at that moment. He urgently required a new, reliable architecture to govern the state. And what happened in Kyiv in 986 was not a spiritual quest. If we call things by their true names, it was a geopolitical tender. Vladimir was holding a casting call for ideologies, filtering out the ones that didn't fit the objectives of his personal dictatorship. Let's run through the list of candidates right alongside him. First up are the Volga Bulgars. Islam, one powerful god, strict order. It seems this is exactly what is needed. But Vladimir turns them down with the famous phrase, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without it." We are used to thinking of this as a joke about the national character, but for a 10th century monarch, a ban on alcohol is not about partying. It is about retaining power. The feast, in those days, was the primary political institution. It was precisely at these feasts, distributing intoxicating mead and silver, that a prince bought the loyalty of his heavy cavalry, those very Varangians and boyars. To ban feasts meant to lose the army. Furthermore, adopting Islam would make Kyiv a spiritual vassal to the distant caliphate. Vladimir did not need a boss in the east. Next, the Khazarian Jews with Judaism. The prince asks them one pragmatic question: where is your homeland? They answer that God grew angry with them and scattered them across the world, giving their lands to the Christians. For Vladimir, the conversation is over. A religion whose God could not protect its own state is useless for building an empire. Then come the envoys from the Pope of Rome, Western Christianity, a massive, wealthy structure, but there is a fatal flaw. In Rome, the Pope places himself above kings. He can excommunicate a monarch from the church. He can absolve vassals from their oaths of fealty. Vladimir had just barely escaped the control of pagan priests. He has absolutely no intention of placing a new supreme arbiter from Rome on his neck. And that leaves the final candidate, Byzantium, Orthodoxy. The Greek delegation does not merely offer a beautiful liturgy. They offer a concept that sounds like music to the Kievan rulers' ears. In Constantinople, the principle of Caesaropapism operates. The emperor is God's viceroy on earth. He personally convenes the councils. He appoints the patriarch. The church in Byzantium does not compete with the state. It functions as its primary ministry. It sanctifies the monarch's power, making any rebellion against him a rebellion against God himself. It was the perfect tool for absolute power. The decision is made, but how to implement it? An ordinary barbarian chieftain would simply ask them to send priests. But Vladimir thinks differently. If he just accepts baptism from the hands of the Greeks, he will become their spiritual son, a subordinate, and he wants to enter the club of civilized empires as an equal. And here, history tosses him a golden opportunity. In 987, a colossal military mutiny erupts in Byzantium. The warlord Bardas Phocas raises an army and marches on Constantinople. The legitimate emperor, Basil II, is in a panic. His throne is shaking. He has no troops to stop the rebellion. Basil sends messengers to the northern barbarians, begging for help, and Vladimir issues an ultimatum. He is ready to send 6,000 of his elite cutthroats south, that very mercenary guard he has long needed to dispose of productively. But in return, he does not demand gold. He demands the unprecedented, the hand of Anna, the emperor's own sister, a porphyrogenita born in the purple, princess. Giving a purple-born Byzantine princess to a pagan, the son of a slave, it is an unheard-of humiliation for Rome. But Bardas Phocas is already at the walls, and Basil agrees. The contract is signed. Vladimir promises to be baptized as soon as Anna arrives. 6,000 Rus warriors sail across the sea. They obliterate the rebel army at the Battle of Abydos. They save Basil's crown. Vladimir waits in Kyiv, preparing for the wedding that will make him the equal of the greatest monarchs on earth. But months pass, and the ships carrying the Byzantine bride never appear on the horizon of the Dnieper. April 13th, 989. The fortress of Abydos on the shores of the Dardanelles Strait. The Byzantine usurper Bardas Phocas leads his regiments out for the decisive battle. He is confident of victory, for the legitimate emperor Basil II has almost no loyal troops left. But it is not Greek infantry that marches onto the field. Stepping out to meet the rebels are 6,000 Rus mercenaries with heavy axes. This is Vladimir's guard. Those very mercenaries sent south under the treaty with Constantinople. The battle turns into a methodical slaughter. The rebellion is crushed, Bardas Phocas is dead, the throne of the empire is saved. The deal on Kyiv's end has been executed flawlessly. Meanwhile, Vladimir sits in his capital and waits for his payment. He is already preparing for baptism. He is waiting for the ships carrying the Porphyrogenita Princess Anna, a marriage that will permanently wash away the stigma of son of a slave and make him the equal of the rulers of the civilized world. A month passes. Navigation on the Black Sea opens. Merchant ships arrive. But there is no Anna. Emperor Basil has simply conned his northern ally. The moment the threat of a coup disappeared, the Byzantine court reverted to its usual arrogant optics. Give our own sister to a barbarian? To a man who only yesterday had a harem of hundreds of women? Constantinople begins openly stalling for time, sending vague diplomatic excuses instead of the bride. For Vladimir, this is not just the collapse of a political deal, it is a catastrophe. It has nothing to do with a broken heart. He had never even seen the woman. It is about a loss of face. He handed over his elite shock army, saved another country, and in return received a public slap in the face. The entire Kievan elite, the boyars, and the remnants of the priesthood see that the Grand Prince has been played for a naive fool. In the brutal coordinate system of the 10th century, a monarch who swallows such a humiliation risks taking a knife in the back from his own people. But it is right here, at the absolute bottom of this political crisis, that Vladimir proves why he became the architect of a state. An ordinary northern chieftain would have snapped into a blind rage, burned a couple of border villages, or started drowning Greek merchants in the Dnieper. But Vladimir has learned a different rule. In the club of great empires, treaties do not function on gratitude or a word of honor. They are respected in only one scenario: if you have your partner by the throat. Byzantium refused to pay because it felt safe again. Therefore, that safety had to be destroyed. The prince does not write angry letters to the emperor. He does not beg for the debt to be repaid. He gathers his troops and marches them straight into Crimea, to the main, wealthiest Byzantine enclave in the northern Black Sea region, the city of Chersonesus. Korsun, the Crimean Peninsula. The walls of Chersonesus, that same Byzantine Korsun. This is not just a rich trading port. It is the empire's main naval base on the Black Sea, its eyes and ears in the northern lands. And right now, beneath these massive fortifications stand rows of Kievan army tents. Vladimir didn't come here for silver. He came to collect a debt. The siege drags on for long months. Korsun seems impregnable, and at this moment, history hands the prince a tool we have already analyzed in detail in a past episode. An arrow with a message flies over the city wall. A local official named Anastas betrays his home and reveals the location of the secret water pipeline to the Kievan forces. Vladimir orders the pipes dug up and cut. The water stops flowing. The city, dying of thirst, capitulates. The prince enters the conquered Korsun and sends a short, undeniable message to Constantinople. Its meaning is crystal clear: I have your main city in Crimea. If Anna does not arrive now, I will march on your capital. Emperor Basil II has no room left for diplomatic maneuvers. He puts his purple-born sister on a ship. And here we arrive at the most famous myth of this era. The chronicle tells an incredibly dramatic scene. Supposedly, right before the bride's arrival, Vladimir suddenly goes blind. Anna urges him to accept the faith immediately. The prince steps down into the baptismal font, the water washes away his sins, and his sight is miraculously restored. It is a flawless metaphor, the darkness of paganism and the light of the new teaching. But we must understand, this story was written by monks a century later. It was vital for them to smooth over one highly inconvenient fact. Their holy baptizer did not come to the faith in tears of repentance. He brought an army, took a Byzantine city hostage, and literally extorted his baptism through armed blackmail. The blindness in the chronicles is an elegant literary smokescreen, an attempt to hide the harsh reality of a political contract. For Vladimir, the baptismal font in the Korsun church served not as a site of mystical revelation, but as a table for signing the most crucial legal document of his life. In the moment the bishop read prayers over him, the prince was washing off the brand of the Robotchich, shedding the skin of a northern barbarian. Stepping out of the water, he draped himself in the cloak of a legitimate monarch, a Christian, the son-in-law of Roman emperors. He forced the civilized world to recognize him as an equal. The wedding is held right there, amidst the siege-exhausted streets. Vladimir got what he came for. The new state architecture is now in his hands. He packs up his trophies, takes the priests, that same traitor Anastas, and heads north. He has to return to Kyiv and explain to his grim, blood-hardened army that the gods they had sworn oaths to all their lives were, as of today, officially cancelled. Spring 989. Vladimir's convoy rides into Kyiv. He left for the south as a mercenary commander and returned as the son-in-law of Byzantine emperors. In his wagon train are Greek priests, icons, and church utensils from Korsun. But more importantly, he has brought back a new architecture of power. And to install it, he had to raise the old one to its foundations. Let's cast aside the romantic imagery of churches. The baptism of the Kyivans is not a story of mass spiritual awakening. It was a brilliantly planned, ruthless police operation. Vladimir didn't try to persuade the priests or hold theological debates in the city squares. He acted like a man executing a hostile, armed takeover of his own state. The first strike is aimed at visual symbols. The prince orders the destruction of the very pantheon he himself erected 9 years ago. The idols are chopped into splinters and burned. Perun, the supreme god of the military elite, gets a different treatment. He is tied to horses' tails and dragged from the hill through the mud. 12 guardsmen walk alongside and methodically beat the statue with heavy sticks. For the 10th century, this is not just vandalism. This is graphic political technology. Vladimir is showing the Kievan mob, look, your most powerful god is being beaten, and he can't throw a lightning bolt in response. He is just a piece of wood. There is nothing to fear anymore. The idol is dumped into the Dnieper. Immediately after this, the prince sends heralds through the city with a short, exhaustive ultimatum. Whoever is not at the river tomorrow, whether rich, poor, beggar, or slave, will be my enemy. The next morning, thousands of people obediently wade into the cold water of the Pochina River, while Greek bishops and the heavily armed druzhina stand watch on the shore. In the capital, this systemic overhaul went relatively bloodlessly. The people of Kyiv remembered all too well what their ruler was capable of if resisted. But the country was massive, and far from everywhere did the change of the operating system look like a submissive swim in the river. In the north, in Novgorod, the people launched an armed rebellion. In a previous episode, we discussed how this problem was handled. Vladimir sent his uncle Dobrynya. They're the exact same man who, 10 years earlier, had set up the pagan sanctuaries over the Volkhov River. Dobrynya didn't waste time on persuasion. To baptize the northern capital, he had to set the city on fire. The Novgorodians accepted the new faith on the ashes of their own homes, staring down the naked swords of the Kievan army. Vladimir broke the spine of the old Rus brutally and swiftly. He had no choice. A dictator understands perfectly. Gradual reforms give the opposition time to unify and strike back. To shift a country onto entirely new tracks, you must burn all the bridges behind you in a single day. He succeeded. The pagan matrix was dismantled, but, hyper-focused on the internal purge and suppressing his own cities, the prince lost sight of another threat. While his guard was chopping up wooden idols in the north, the southern borders of Rus were left completely unattended. And looking across those borders at a weakened Kyiv, preoccupied with its internal coup, was the cavalry of the Pechenegs. The steppe had decided its time had come. The idols have been cast into the rivers. The opposition in the north is crushed. The new ideology is cemented into law. It would seem the system is built, and one can finally exhale. But every surgical operation has side effects. While Vladimir was breaking the back of the old order inside the country, the southern borders were left completely defenseless, and the steppe does not forgive weakness. The Pechenegs close in on Kyiv, a fast, merciless cavalry. They do not know how to besiege fortresses, but they don't need to. They simply scorch every living thing around the capital, cutting the city off from its resources. And here, Vladimir makes a decision that permanently severs him from his past. To understand the scale of this psychological shift, remember his father. Remember the furious Sviatoslav. He despised Kyiv. He suffocated behind its wooden walls. He dreamed of moving the capital to the Danube and spent his entire life in the saddle. Sviatoslav operated purely on the logic of expansion until he lost his head at the Dnieper Rapids, leaving the country utterly defenseless. The father was a pure Viking, a conqueror. The son decides to become a master, an owner. Vladimir realizes the economy of raiding has exhausted itself. You cannot build an empire if your capital can be burned down by nomads every single spring. Territory needs a rigid perimeter. It needs borders. And so, he launches a colossal infrastructure project. The Chronicle records his order with one dry line. He began to found cities on the Desna, and the Oster, and the Trubezh, and the Sula, and the Stugna. Behind these words hides a massive forced resettlement of peoples. Vladimir violently uproots thousands of people from their ancestral homes in the north. Novgorodians, Krivichins, Chuds, Vyatichins, and drives them south. He populates his new frontier garrisons with them. Simultaneously, the construction of the Serpent's Walls begins. This isn't just a mound of dirt. It is an immensely complex engineering chain of fortifications, as tall as a 3-story building, interwoven with massive oak logs on the inside, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. An early warning system. If Pecheneg cavalry appears on the horizon, signal fires flare up along the walls. The garrison has time to close the gates, and Kyiv has time to mobilize its heavy guard. Look at this transformation. The man who rode to power on the shoulders of foreign mercenaries just to plunder his neighbors is now thinking in decades. He is engineering a sedentary state. He blocked the river fords, built fortresses, locked the steppe out. It seemed he had calculated absolutely everything. But the nomads knew how to find breaches in even the thickest walls. And in just a few years, this calculated, secure world will collapse, forcing the Emperor of Eastern Europe to literally crawl in the roadside mud to save his own life. August 996. The capital is celebrating the Feast of the Transfiguration. Vladimir is at the absolute peak of his power. Byzantium has been subdued, the idols are overthrown, the new faith is taking root. In the south, thousands of people are erecting the Serpent's Walls, a titanic defensive line designed to permanently seal the country off from the wild field. And suddenly, a report arrives. The Pechenegs have broken through the border at Vasilev. That is only a day's ride from Kyiv. Here, Vladimir commits the classic mistake of any highly successful ruler. He begins to believe in his own invulnerability. The chronicle notes one critical detail. The prince rides out to meet the enemy with a small druzhina. Why did he do this? It wasn't stupidity, it was systemic overconfidence. Vladimir was used to thinking within the parameters of the new reality he had built. He assumed the fortress system was already working. In his worldview, this wasn't a full-scale nomadic strike, but merely a raiding party that had slipped through, which needed to be swiftly pinned against the Stugna River and annihilated by his personal guard. Why raise a massive militia and waste time when he has his elite, ironclad heavy cavalry? He marches his guard out into the field near Vasilev and collides head-on with a reality that cannot be concreted over with walls. We are used to imagining medieval battles as the clash of two even shield walls, but the Pechenegs didn't fight like that. For the heavy Kievan druzhina, this battle turned into shadowboxing. Steppe cavalry acts like a swarm. They have no single center you can break with a battering ram charge. When Vladimir's guard surged forward, the Pechenegs simply parted, pulling the Kievans deep into their formation, and then slammed the flanks shut. A methodical, cold-blooded slaughter began. Heavy armor, perfect for storming cities, became a death trap in the August heat. The nomads didn't engage in close-quarters sword combat. They circled at a safe distance, gunning down the princely elite with stiff composite bows. Every loose arrow found its mark in the tightly packed formation. The ranks broke. The elite army of the empire lost its cohesion and devolved into a panicked mob trying to claw its way out of the cauldron. A frenzied rout ensued. Imagine this scene, stripping away all the chronicle pathos. A man who only yesterday considered himself the equal of Roman Caesars is running for his life through the August dust. His retinue is scattered. His bodyguards are dead. Behind his back, the roar of nomads methodically executing the wounded grows louder. Vladimir reaches a small local river. There stands a wooden bridge. The prince clambers down and presses himself into the damp earth, hiding under the creaking floorboards. Above him, the thunder of hooves erupts. Pecheneg patrols gallop directly over his head. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, dry dirt falls onto the face of the master of Eastern Europe. If even a single rider dismounts right now to water his horse, the history of Rus ends right here, in this ditch. They will turn the prince's skull into a drinking cup, just as they had done with the skull of his father, Sviatoslav, a quarter of a century earlier. It is precisely in these minutes, under the Vasilev Bridge, that all of Vladimir's famous political cynicism evaporates. That cold calculation with which he extorted his baptism outside the walls of Korsun vanishes without a trace. Left entirely alone with imminent death, the dictator turns to God, not as a tool of state ideology, but as the only power capable of keeping him alive. He makes a vow. If he makes it out from under this bridge alive, he will build a grand church in Vasilyev in honor of the Transfiguration. This is no longer an administrative construction project. This is the price of his breath. That night, dodging patrols, Vladimir makes it back to Kyiv. He survived. But a completely different politician returned from under the Vasilyev Bridge. Analyzing the catastrophe, the prince realizes a terrifying truth. Walls and forts do not work on their own. An iron guard can be wiped out in the steppe in a single hour. Police control and fear are simply not enough to hold such a colossal territory when it takes a direct hit. For the empire to survive, he needed more than the mere submission of his people. He needed their genuine, sacrificial love. The people had to want to defend this city as desperately as he had clung to life under the floorboards of that bridge. And Vladimir decides to buy this love, on a scale unprecedented in Europe. After the sticky mud of the Vasilyev ravine, the Kievan court is illuminated by blinding gold. We are accustomed to perceiving this period of Vladimir's reign through the prism of folk epics, bylinas. Embedded deep in our collective unconscious is the image of a benevolent elder sitting at the head of a long table, listening to guzli players and endlessly pouring intoxicating mead for legendary heroes. A generous, good-natured ruler who earned the nickname the Red Sun. But try to cast aside this fairy tale veil and look at these feasts through the eyes of a pragmatic politician. For a 10th century monarch, a feast was absolutely not a form of entertainment or a way to pass the time. It was an incredibly complex and vital state institution. Returning from under the Vasilyev Bridge, Vladimir understood the main thing. Fear and military force no longer guaranteed his survival. If his vast transit empire was to withstand a serious blow from steppe cavalry without falling apart, he needed the absolute loyalty of his subjects, and the prince begins methodically buying this loyalty. He launches a machine of social redistribution, the likes of which Eastern Europe had never seen. Every Sunday, the princely court opens its gates. Any resident of the capital can come in and receive food or drink. But Vladimir goes further. He orders carts to be loaded with bread, meat, fish, vegetables, and barrels of kvass. These supply convoys roll through the muddy Kievan streets, and his guardsmen distribute provisions to the sick, the crippled, and the destitute, everyone who physically cannot reach the princely court on their own. In a world where a single bad harvest meant a slow, starving death for entire districts, such actions had the effect of an exploding bomb. This was not Christian charity in its purest form. It was a stroke of political genius. Vladimir was converting military plunder gathered at the borders into the status of the ideal, merciful father of the nation. He compelled the lower classes to pray for his health, forever cutting off the tribal aristocracy's ability to incite a popular revolt against him. At this exact moment, another brilliant PR campaign is executed. Kyiv begins minting its own gold and silver coins. There was absolutely no economic necessity for this step. Markets in Rus functioned perfectly well using Arab dirhams, Byzantine solidi, or simply marten pelts. The issuance of the so-called zlatniks and srebreniks served a purely ideological purpose. Stamped onto the thin circle of metal was a portrait of the prince himself, wearing an imperial crown, bordered by a short, unarguable inscription. Vladimir is on the throne, and this is his silver. The ruler was literally placing the symbol of his boundless power into the hands of every merchant and every guardsman. It seemed he had foreseen absolutely everything. He fenced the country off from external enemies with impenetrable walls. He bought the love of the common people with bread, and the loyalty of the druzhina with silver. He dismantled the dangerous power of the pagan priests and replaced them with a fully loyal church. The architect could finally sit back and enjoy the view of the structure he had built. But absolute power has one fatal flaw. The dictator ages. Vladimir begins to worry about how to hold this colossal mechanism together after his death. The vast territories from Ladoga to the Black Sea still remembered their independence. How to keep them from scattering, how to permanently eliminate the separatism of local tribal elites. And the prince makes a decision that will become his greatest, most fatal historical mistake. A true point of no return. Vladimir had 12 sons from different women, 12 heirs to the dynasty, and the aging monarch decides to use them as living cement. He dispatches his sons to be governors in the key hubs of the empire. He sends Izyaslav to Polotsk, Mstislav to Tmutarakan, Boris to Rostov, Gleb to Murom, and one of the eldest, the limping and ambitious Yaroslav, is sent to govern the wealthiest northern city, Novgorod. In theory, this scheme looked flawless. Instead of foreign, unreliable tribal chiefs, the cities are now governed by a single princely bloodline. The family acts as the guarantor of the state's integrity. But in practice, Vladimir made a monstrous miscalculation. He forgot his own youth. He forgot that the presence of shared blood had never once stopped the Rurikids from fratricide. By scattering his sons across the principalities, the Kievan ruler didn't unify the country. With his own hands, he handed ambitious young princes their own personal armies, independent financial streams, and spectacularly wealthy territories. He planted a dozen ticking time bombs beneath the foundation of his empire. All they had to do was grow up. And when the detonator finally triggered, the first strike came from the exact place where Vladimir himself had once begun his own bloody path south. From the cold, snow-covered Novgorod, the year 1014, the Grand Prince of Kyiv receives a report from the north that permanently shatters the illusion of his control over the country. Novgorod refuses to pay tribute. This wasn't a mundane delay in taxes due to a poor harvest. Every year, the northern capital sent Kyiv a colossal sum, 2,000 silver grivnas. This wasn't just tribute. It was the financial leash by which the south firmly held the rebellious north. And now, the Novgorodian governor had publicly severed this leash, declaring his total independence. This rebellious governor was Yaroslav, the future Yaroslav the Wise, Vladimir's own son. Let's look at this figure more closely. Yaroslav was the son of Rogneda, that very princess of Polotsk, whose family Vladimir had cold-bloodedly slaughtered on his way to power. The boy grew up alongside his mother, absorbing her heavy, unspoken hatred. He knew perfectly well exactly whose blood his father's throne stood upon. And now, having been handed a massively wealthy trade hub and vast resources, he struck at the aging ruler's most vulnerable point. For Vladimir, this rebellion was not just a localized political crisis. History was reflecting his own past with terrifying precision. Look at where exactly the threat was coming from. It was from the north that Rurik had once come to assert his rule. It was from there that Oleg the prophet had sailed down the rivers to murder the rulers of Kyiv and found a new state. Finally, it was from this very same snowbound city, almost 40 years ago, that a young, ambitious Vladimir had marched out with an army of mercenaries to kill his own brother and take the throne by force. Now, his own son stood on that same bank of the Volkhov River, hiring those same Scandinavian cutthroats with silver, ready to march south. The mechanism of the coup, which the empire's architect had once used so brilliantly himself, was now flawlessly working against him. The Kievan court froze in anticipation. The 11 other sons, governing their own principalities, watched their father's reaction intensely. Should he show even a drop of senile softness now, should he attempt to negotiate with Yaroslav tomorrow, the state would ignite with a dozen new rebellions. An empire bound by fear and force is physically incapable of forgiving mercy. Vladimir makes the only choice possible within his coordinate system. He issues an order that the chronicle preserves word for word. Clear the paths and pave the bridges. This meant the beginning of a full-scale civil war. The old, already heavily sick prince orders his men to hack paths through impenetrable forests and assemble loyal regiments so he can personally lead them against Novgorod. For the sake of preserving the state, he is forced to prepare to murder his own child. The guard is assembled, weapons are distributed, the country holds its breath, awaiting a fratricidal bloodbath. But this campaign will never begin. The dictator's body will surrender just one step before he can give his final, terrible command. July 1015. A suffocating heat hangs over the Kievan hills. A massive army is gathered in the capital. The regiments are ready to march north to punish the rebellious Yaroslav, but the order is delayed day after day. The commander-in-chief does not emerge from his chambers in the suburban residence of Berestovo. Vladimir is dying. Sickness is burning the old prince away rapidly, and lying in his stifling tower, listening to the distant hum of the military camp, he confronts the most terrifying realization of his life. He sees the absolute collapse of his central idea. The architect thought that by distributing his sons as governors, he would replace the unreliable tribal chieftains with his own blood and permanently bind the country together. But he failed to account for the nature of that blood. The blood of the Rurikids did not know how to share power. It only knew how to take it by force. Assess the arrangement of pieces on this lethal chessboard through the eyes of the dying ruler. Right now, right here in Kyiv, is Sviatopolk, the eldest and most unpredictable of his sons, whom Vladimir had previously kept in prison for treason. Boris, the father's favorite, has taken the best part of the elite guard into the steppe to hunt for pechenegs. Yaroslav is locked down in the north with his Varangian mercenaries. Vladimir understands with crystal clarity the moment his heart stops, these men, to whom he entrusted the empire, will instantly start slaughtering one another. The cycle he himself set in motion 40 years ago, stepping over the corpse of his brother Yarapok, is now ruthlessly closing in on his own children. All his grand construction projects, his stone churches, his border walls, and his new Los Olivet will burn in the fires of a new civil war. A war he prepared with his own hands by giving his sons their own provincial armies. On July 15th, his breathing stops forever. And here we return to the very scene with which we opened this story. Remember this night in Berestovo, the panic of his inner circle, the sound of axes smashing through planks. The servants are tearing down the wall of the tower because carrying the ruler's body out through the door is a bad omen. They wrap the dead emperor in a carpet and secretly, like thieves, load him onto a sled. In the shadows of the courtyard, the treasurer, Anastas the Korsunian, presses against the wall, realizing that his safe life in the capital has just come to an end. They hide the corpse of the greatest ruler, not from the pechenegs, and not from the Byzantines. They are hiding him from his own son, Sviatopolk, desperately trying to delay the inevitable massacre for the throne by at least a couple of days. It would seem this is the ultimate, inglorious finale. Vladimir's life's work has collapsed, and the country is doomed to drown in blood. But history disposed of this legacy in an entirely different way. On July 15th, 1015, Vladimir's heart stopped, and his worst nightmare came true almost instantly. The state, bound together by the iron will of one man, seemed to crumble in that very second. The eldest son, Sviatopolk, seizes Kyiv and begins methodically purging his rivals. Boris and Gleb are the first to die. Yaroslav gathers yet another army of Varangian mercenaries in the north and marches south. The country plummets rapidly into the exact fratricidal bloodbath the aging architect had tried so desperately to prevent by scattering his children across the provinces. At first glance, this is an absolute collapse, a finale proving that nothing eternal can be built on naked violence. But if we take a step back and look at this civil war more closely, we see something astonishing. Vladimir's sons were butchering each other, yes, but they were no longer trying to rip the country into separate, independent pieces. Not a single one of them wanted to be just the chieftain of the Drevlians or the prince of the Radomicians. They were fighting for control over a unified center for the Kievan throne. The mechanism built by the bastard son of the slave Malusha held firm, and in this lies the answer to the main question we posed at the beginning of this episode. How did a brutal barbarian, a rapist and a fratricide become the greatest of saints? It has absolutely nothing to do with moral purification or divine revelation in the Korsun font. Vladimir achieved an unprecedented technological breakthrough. He burned the old tribal identities away with a branding iron. Before him, the people on these lands defined themselves by the forests and rivers where they lived. After him, they defined themselves by the faith he forced upon them. He created the institution of the Church, and the Church in the Middle Ages held a monopoly on information. It repaid its creator in full. It wrote the chronicles. It carefully smoothed over the rough edges, hid his military extortion of Byzantium behind a beautiful legend of sudden blindness, and forgave him the rivers of spilled blood. Vladimir bought his sainthood by forging a nation and giving it a unified voice. 225 years will pass. In the winter of 1240, the Tumans of Batu Khan will approach the ice-covered walls of Kyiv. The city will fall. The last defenders of the capital will lock themselves in that very church of the Tithst, the first stone temple of Rus, which Vladimir swore to build when he lay in the mud, hiding from nomads under the Vasiliev Bridge. Under the heavy bombardment of Mongol catapults, the vaults of the church will give way and collapse, burying hundreds of Kyivans underneath. Beneath that exact same mountain of stone rubble, the marble sarcophagus of the baptizer himself will disappear. If you travel to Kyiv today and walk down Volodymyrska Street, you will find only the preserved outline of the foundation. Of the man who redrew the map of Eastern Europe, not even a grave remains. No authentic belongings, no armor, no portraits from his lifetime survive, except for the barely distinguishable, worn-out faces on a few rare silver coins. But the paradox of a true architect is that he does not need a marble sarcophagus. Formally, Vladimir has no resting place. Practically, he dissolved into the very civilizational code of this space. The empire survived, but for it to fully attain its golden age, Vladimir's heirs would have to walk through hell. In our next series, we will dissect that merciless slaughter of his sons for the throne. We will see how Yaroslav became the wise by stepping over corpses, and we will try to give an honest answer to the question of who actually murdered the first Russian saints. But we won't limit ourselves to Rus alone. In parallel, we are opening a completely new chapter, because while Vladimir was gathering his lands, an identical, agonizing process was occurring right on his western borders. We will tell the story of the birth of Poland, a rival state that will walk a similar path of baptism and blood, and with which Rus will collide in a brutal struggle for the right to be the supreme center of the Slavic world. It is exactly there, to the Poles, that the traitor Anastas will very soon flee with the Kievan treasury. And it is from there that a blow will come that will very nearly annihilate everything Vladimir built. Thank you for walking this path with us. Leave your comments and subscribe to the channel. See you in the 11th century.